The 1995 Formula 1 World Championship would see a raft of changes from the previous year, continuing on from the safety improvements that were added gradually throughout '94 following the tragic deaths of Ayrton Senna and Roland Ratzenberger at Imola. The changes included a reduction of engine capacity from 3.5 litres to just 3 litres, the sides of the cockpits being raised to better protect the driver's head, which would be increased further in '96 thanks to the introduction of the head restraint brought about by Mika Häkkinen's crash in '95, and then a further 22 years later, thanks to the introduction of the halo, an extension to the chassis at the front to better protect the driver's legs, a blunter profile of the front nose, unless your name was McLaren, a step flat bottom of the car to reduce downforce, and a mandatory side impact test to improve driver safety if they were sideswiped. This meant the cars looked drastically different when the Formula 1 circus arrived for the first race of the season at Interlagos, but moments after that race had finished, that wouldn't be the main talking point coming out of the Grand Prix. This is the story of the near disqualification involving Benetton and Williams. After winning his first World Championship in controversial fashion at Adelaide in '94, Michael Schumacher went into the 1995 season determined to retain his title, whilst his team Benetton had the goal of trying to do the double, having failed to win the Constructors the previous year due to their second car not delivering the results required to compete with Williams. Sounds similar to another team that's having issues in that department nowadays. Benetton, acknowledging this, decided to tackle this issue head on by doing two important changes. One being a change that they had already done the penultimate race the previous year, with the team hiring Johnny Herbert to partner alongside Michael from the '94 Japanese Grand Prix and would continue to be Michael's teammate heading into '95, whilst the other change involved a change in engine supply, as gone was the Ford V8 engine that had powered the team since 1988, and in its place was a Renault V10, the same engine that was powering their rivals Williams. Benetton were able to acquire these engines after striking a deal with Ligier to buy out their existing contract with Renault, as a result of the Benetton team principal at the time, Flavio Briatore, also having a stake in the Ligier team, which explains why Michael Schumacher was able to do a test with the '94 Ligier the previous year. Don't think I need to tell you how he compared to Ligier's regular drivers at the time, Panis and Bernard. Ligier would end up adopting Mugen Honda engines as a result, an engine that they would take away from Minardi, who had previously signed a deal with them, but Flavio, being the kind, gentle soul that he is, and I say that with gritted teeth, would end up compensating Ligier by allowing him to use the same chassis as Benetton for that year, a design that Ligier would continue to use in '96, which allowed Olivier Panis to take an unlikely win at the chaotic Monaco Grand Prix, a win which would turn out to be the Frenchman's only win in Formula 1. Benetton's deal with Renault would end up being perfect for their French fuel supplier Elf, who had been supplying fuel to Renault-powered teams since 1977, which also included the Williams team. With the team now having the same engine and perks as Williams, there was no excuse for the team not to do the double, even if Williams looked like they had the quickest car come the end of pre-season testing. The season would kick off as it did the previous year at the Interlagos circuit in Sao Paulo. The weekend would start poorly for Michael, who would end up having a crash in qualifying, with him being forced to take the spare car for the rest of the session. This in turn would put him on the back foot, as whilst he would still be on the pace, he wouldn't grab pole, as Williams would transfer the promise that they showed in pre-season testing by grabbing the first pole position of the season, courtesy of Damon Hill, who would beat Michael by 0.3 of a second, whilst Hill's teammate David Coulthard would find himself only 0.04 behind the German in third. Johnny Herbert, meanwhile, would complete the checkerboard pattern of Williams's and Benetton's by placing his car in 4th place, but he would find himself 0.8 off Hill, with him being more closer to the Ferraris than he was of the top three. By the time the race got going though, it was business as usual, with Michael jumping Damon at the start, whilst Herbert would get bogged down and lose a few positions in the process. The top three of Schumacher, Hill and Coulthard would initially pull a bit of a gap to the rest of the field as the laps ticked by, before Schumacher and Hill would leave Coulthard behind to duke amongst themselves. Lap 18 would arrive and Schumacher would be the first of the top two to blink by making his first pit stop, which would end up going smoothly, but once he rejoined, he found himself stuck behind the Ferrari of Gerhard Berger, who was yet to make his first stop. Schumacher would get by on Berger a lap later into turn 1, but the hold up from Berger would cost him so much that by the time Hill pitted on lap 21, the Brit would end up emerging in front to take the lead of the race once everyone in front made their pit stop. Once he got his tyres up to temperature, Hill would start to put a bit of distance between himself and Schumacher, demonstrating the pace Williams showed during pre-season testing. Everything was looking good for Hill until lap 30, when he would suffer gearbox issues which resulted in him losing second gear. Then a lap later, the gearbox would completely seize up and would result in Hill spinning off at turn 2, bringing his race to a close and handing Schumacher the lead once again. He wouldn't be the only Renault-powered car to have their race end early, as on the same lap, Johnny Herbert, whose race had already been compromised, would also retire from the race as a result of being taken out of the race by the Tyrrell of Ukyo Katayama. With Hill out of the race, Coulthard was Williams' only bet on trying to beat Michael, and with the pair on different strategies, with DC on a 2-stop and Michael on a 3-stop, there was every chance the Scotsman could snatch his first ever win. The order would remain the same after the second stops, but with Michael needing to make one more stop before the end, he would need to build a gap to Coulthard to have any chance of staying in the lead after his stop. And that's exactly what he would do, and by the time he made his third stop on lap 52, he came out still in front of Coulthard by 8 seconds, a gap which would remain the same when the checkered flag came out, with Michael taking his first win of 1995 ahead of Coulthard, with Gerhard Berger, who had an eventful race, rounding out the podium in third despite being a lap down. A great start to the season for Michael, with Williams, despite losing out on the win, still coming out of the weekend with a lot of positives, thanks to Hill demonstrating before his retirement that their car had a lot of potential to dethrone Michael come the end of the season. But their joy would quickly turn sour later on in the evening. Hours after the race had concluded, it was announced that both Schumacher and Coulthard had been disqualified from the Brazilian Grand Prix as a result of both of their cars' fuel sample not matching the fingerprint sample that had been submitted by ELF, the fuel supplier for both teams, prior to the start of the season. This alleged illegal sample would have more than likely have been in Hill and Herbert's cars, and would have probably have seen them been disqualified as well had they not retired from the race for separate reasons, though interestingly enough, Ligier were not brought up on this verdict, despite the fact that they also had ELF as their fuel supplier, and the fact that one of their cars actually did finish the race, which was Aguri Suzuki, who brought his car home in 8th. The only reason I can think why they weren't brought up in this was because they were using Mugen Honda engines instead of Renault engines, with both engines maybe requiring a different fuel sample to be able to function properly. But that's what I believe anyway. Maybe you guys know the real reason in the comments below. Be interested to know if you do know the answer. But back to the topic in hand. After the verdict came out, which subsequently handed Gerhard Berger the win, it's safe to say that both Benetton and Williams were completely miffed about this decision, along with ELF, who were convinced that the fuel was legal, so much so that when they eventually got the sample back and tested it themselves at their base in Paris, they found it to be at the legal requirement according to their reading. And with this knowledge in mind, both Benetton and Williams, after hearing back from ELF, appealed the decision of the stewards, with the hearing being held at the World Motorsport Council in Paris on the 13th of April. This meant, as a result, that Berger's win, which he inherited, would end up being provisional for the time being, and it would continue to be provisional when the F1 circus arrived at Buenos Aires for the second race of the championship, as with the meeting scheduled for the 13th of April, it meant that both Benetton and Williams would have to contest the race in Argentina, still with a cloud hanging over their heads. The race itself would not go well for both Schumacher and Coulthard, with Michael only being able to finish the race in third as a result of him being off the pace during that weekend, whilst Coulthard, after starting from pole, would have throttle issues that would plague his race to the point where after he initially got it restarted 10 laps earlier, it would fully seize up, bringing his race to an end. Damon Hill, on the other hand, would have a much better time, and he would bounce back from the gearbox issues at Interlagos to take his first win of the season, ahead of Alesi and Schumacher, who would round off the podium. Berger, meanwhile, the provisional championship leader, would finish the race in 6th, which meant that if the World Motorsport Council stuck with the original verdict, he would lead the championship going into Imola by just 1 point ahead of Damon Hill, with Schumacher only on 4 points, whilst Coulthard would be sat on nothing, whilst in the Constructors, Ferrari would lead the way by 11 points ahead of Williams and McLaren, who would be tied for 2nd, whilst Benetton would be a further 3 points back in 4th. And whilst Ferrari would keep this lead, Berger's lead would end up becoming only a pipe dream, as 4 days after the race in Argentina came to a close, it was announced that both Benetton and Williams had won their appeal, as it was found that the system that the FIA used to get the analysis back from the fuel sample was slightly faulty, meaning that both Schumacher and Coulthard had their results from the Brazilian Grand Prix reinstated and won back the points that they had accumulated from that weekend, with the FIA making changes from Imola onwards to avoid a similar fault from happening again. But whilst the drivers got their points, the same couldn't be said for the constructors, as both Benetton and Williams still had their points excluded from the final results, as whilst it was proven that the system they had a slight fault, the FIA still felt that Benetton and Williams had broke the fuel rules, and so as essentially a compromise, the drivers were allowed to keep their points, but the teams weren't. This meant that both teams were still behind Ferrari in the championship, but with Ferrari now having less points than what they would have had the FIA stuck with the original verdict, it meant that both Benetton and Williams had less work to do to claw back the deficit. This, as you can imagine, made Ferrari furious, with Niki Lauda, who at the time was an advisor for the team, believing that the FIA had essentially lost the plot, as he couldn't understand how the driver and team could be separated from the verdict, as by the FIA's own logic, teams were fine to build and develop cars that didn't conform to the regulations at the expense of only losing constructor points, with points accumulated by the drivers not being affected by this rule break. Gerhard Berger also shared the same feelings as Niki, with him saying that the sport had become a joke, to which Michael hit back, saying that Gerhard should focus on his driving, given he finished a lap down before the results were initially adjusted. The whole controversy had a similar feeling to the near disqualification that Ferrari would face 4 years later, which ironically also involved Michael. But whilst Ferrari's successful appeal in '99 was understandable, as I mentioned in a video I did about the topic earlier this year, this one though, I'm struggling to see how they got to that decision, because although they admitted that the system they used was faulty, they still felt that both teams had broke the rules. So if they still had this feeling, then why did they reinstate the original results? Because, as Niki Lauda pointed out, the driver still drives the car, and if a team has broken the rules, then not only is the team benefiting from the irregularity, the driver is as well. Now, granted, there are instances where a driver and a team can be two separate entities from a verdict. Take for example what happened to McLaren at the 2000 Austrian Grand Prix. In that race, Mika Hakkinen would go on to take the win, and with it grab 10 championship points towards his pursuit of winning a third successive driver's crown. But hours after the race had concluded, his team McLaren would lose those 10 points towards their pursuit of winning the Constructors' Championship, as it was found that the electronic control unit in Hakkinen's car had a mandated seal that was missing. The FIA on that day concluded that whilst the missing seal didn't give Hakkinen's car any performance advantage, hence why he kept the win and the 10 points that came with it, they felt that McLaren didn't do their due diligence that day of ensuring that the ECU was fitted into the car properly, which meant that when it came time for the FIA to do a reading of the car's telemetry to ensure nothing illegal was happening, they found it difficult to get a result out of it. This is one of the few instances where the driver and the team can be separated from an on-track verdict, but when it comes to the verdict that happened in '95, I find it difficult to separate the two. That being said, the FIA themselves admitted that the system they used was faulty, so if that was the case, then why weren't the constructors' points reinstated as well? Regardless of whether the FIA felt that they had still broken the rules or not, they had no evidence to support this, as by their own admission, and I'll keep reiterating it, the system they used was faulty. How can you let your own gut feeling have a say on an outcome if the system you use wasn't taking readings properly? If a system is proven to be glitched, then you can't use the analysis given on that machine as factual, and so as a result, the team should have been given their results back towards both championships, as there was no evidence to support the claim that they had broken the rules. But in the end, the FIA chose to go down the route that they ended up taking, and it makes the verdict sound very hypocritical when you consider the fact that 4 years later, Ferrari were also thrown out of a race due to a faulty system, only for them to get their points back after they successfully proved that the original measurements was incorrect. And it wasn't just the drivers' points that got reinstated, it was also the constructors. So if they got both sets of points back, why didn't Benetton and Williams 4 years prior? I'll leave it with you guys to come up with a reason in the comments below, although I've got a feeling what most of you will say, even if I don't agree with it. Either way, this controversy at the beginning of the season would end up doing nothing come season's end, as even if the disqualification for both Michael and DC stood, Michael and Benetton would still end up doing the double come the end of the season, with the only notable difference being what the final gap would have been between Michael and Damon, as Michael would have won it by 23 points instead of 33 points. So, whilst the verdict itself had no effect on the championship, what we can say is that it was another example of a long list of stupid decisions that the FIA have done over its many years of operation, and as we have seen in the years afterwards, it certainly won't be the last. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in 3 weeks for the next video. Till then, take care.